I've just attended a philosophical lecture on stoicism, and uh, certainly quite a rich topic. Let me just try to read some of this from a handout. It might just summarize things and actually give my listeners some anchoring before I just go rambling off. The two pillars of Stoicism: practice, virtue, ethics, which is primarily made up of wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance, the four cardinal virtues. And the second pillar is the dichotomy of control, which is that it's up to you, your judgments, rational response, or it's not up to you. For example, your health, reputation, office. And based on sort of being able to place anything into that dichotomy means that you can enjoy stoic well-being. If it's under your control, you can do something about it, and if it's not, then you can't. Now, I was trying to generate a loose thesis that the fundamental incompleteness of Stoicism has to do with its inability to sort of to deal with the burden of freedom in some sense. That as long as you give it a context, it's very capable of deploying itself and responding correctly in a context. But if you actually give a Stoic philosopher real unbridled power to do something creative and, let's say, purely positive and prospective, then I think the weakness of Stoicism sort of, that it's a very good navigation device, but sort of, it's like a compass. You can always use it to work out how to traverse, but it doesn't sort of it doesn't substitute for the actual landscape, and it doesn't tell you if you actually are given some great gift, what you would sort of construct in an ideal circumstance, let's just say. So in some sense, because a lot of its training also is the sort of the negation of ideals and idealistic thinking, which I would say is a good training method in terms of disabusing oneself of the seduction in sort of being image driven, or being I actually try to illustrate this point in sort of two separate points, which is the one being the real problem that it has is in achievement. Who is the achiever of achievement? In some sense, Stoicism dissolves the agent in merely being a vessel of justice, or being a vessel of one's own sort of principal values in some sense. And so one doesn't gain ownership of achievement, and therefore there is nothing to be lost. And in some strange paradoxical sense, there is a kind of radical ownership that is occurring in terms of focusing one's experience on the immediate actualization and engagement in some sense. And so you sacrifice achievement for an ongoing process of engagement. And you never sort of let your mind drift into some kind of meta narrative, or sort of consequential consideration, that you're always just doing the best you can in each decision, in each potential deliberation, in maximizing for all future possible deliberation, in some sense. But I believe that this does lead to somewhat of a problem, because in some sense then what the achievement that the Stoic is trying to maximize is potential achievement, which is, another way of saying like a positive aim or a positive purpose or a goal or even a dream. And it has problems with that because those are ideals or idealistic. And perhaps it doesn't say that you can't have ideals so much as that you are reconciled with their inaccessibility. And then you sort of have to make another sort of compromised, positive or prospective, sort of proactive movement within a particular context. Now, this is what I was trying to get. I think that a case should actually be made for another Stoicism. What I would, and maybe this is actually within Stoicism, and I'm just sort of so unschooled that I have no idea what I'm talking about. But I think that what effectively Stoicism suffers from is that it doesn't have a meta-Stoicism about itself, in that it has to, I believe, resign itself to a consequentialist frame. So it has to place itself as an object in a narrative, and it has to say, I'm reconciled with my life, having that sort of narrative label tagged onto it. And in some sense, I think then it is capable of doing some horse trading and therefore maximizing its prospective reach. But that requires a craft and an analysis which is not merely a utilitarian one, that is a dynamic and complicated one, and that would even be hard to start to describe. And there might already be some deal of that, even in just sort of the trade-offs that have to be made between the four cardinal virtues. There was an interesting discussion, sort of in what would a Stoic response be to another moral concern or claim to do with antinatalism, and this is. I think it is fundamentally problematic for Stoics because it just does not have a resource to draw upon in order to respond to something like antinatalism. It's really beyond it. Because the four cardinal virtues themselves, although they might sort of, they're from an individual perspective, where antinatalism, at least a lot of its arguments, I think, are a kind of meta-analysis of a kind. It's an analysis of a set of moral concerns, not just. Whereas Stoicism only considers the perspective from within the basket of existing concerns, and this goes back to my general problem with Stoicism, is that it is almost fundamentally reactive. It doesn't have an independent sense of proactive purpose. Within a context, it can be very proactive and maximize its own internal efficacy and maximize its own internal virtue. Um, and in some sense, a way of debasing it is, I believe, to sort of say, well, actually, although you are caught up in your immediate circumstance and your immediate sort of engagement with life and moral deliberation, uh, you can also consider that you are also sort of conforming to some narrative, and you also have a hand or a potential. You can put some of that into the category of, well, it's kind of within your control. I guess it depends on how much you are willing to sort of politically play the line between uh, your judgment and your and let's say a culture of a collected or a collective judgment. Um, is interesting because I think almost the level of collective participation is itself is the gray area where these issues start to sort of come undone. I do think that there's a whole realm of politics here, which sort of politics and intellectualism, where there are broader gray areas, which I'm going to start getting into now. So I think another way of delineating Stoicism and getting down into these deeper issues is the logos was discussed quite heavily. I would actually characterize Stoicism, and this is, uh, I don't know if this is a unique interpretation, probably not, but my particular, what occurred to me while I was listening to this presentation was that the logos is being uh, very particularly bounded and channeled and focused and demarcated. And that is what gives Stoicism its power. And I'm going to characterize that demarcation now. So I think what's happening, it's not just merely the separation of logos and mythos, as was discussed, but it's specifically, I do think that that is what is happening. But what I think is ironic is that there were some threads of thought that were followed which actually do not straddle that line carefully at all, and in fact actually end up mixing it. Even in the name of the logos, it's mixing the logos with the mythos, and I think that is like a kind of a perpetual moral hazard, and I'm going to try and make a clearer delineation of how these things are kept apart and how Stoicism is actually acting to keep these things apart, and how that leads to a general incompleteness, or an insoluble kind of thing. Although it still makes it a practical, it's still, yeah, I don't see it so much as a philosophy. Well, it's philosophical in some sense, but it's more of like a way of doing something. It's more like a technique in some sense. It's a philosophical technique, um, or a method, but I know I think that it can't really lay claim to being a coherent philosophy. Um, or that might be a semantic relevancy anyway. Okay, so let me just get on with it. The I think that the way it sets itself up is that it says that the logos applies to principles of morality or the field of morality exclusively. It does not apply to any thought or consideration or issue in life in some sense. There might be some, well, there could be other concerns, other philosophical inquiries, but that is not necessarily characterized as stoical. But I think that the stoical expression specifically is that the logos um, applies to morality, and it specifically does not apply to other considerations. And so, in some sense, that preserves the immediate experience. And one, therefore, does not abuse the logos in terms of following and elaborating and investing into a kind of hodgepodge concoction or synthesis of logos and mythos. So, it's like you can sit down and think through any number of things, right? Um, there's an inexhaustible, infinite possibility of things that one might meditate upon. Um, the the healthy functioning of the logos, therefore, is not to not go down rabbit holes, but to keep its powder dry, as it were, and to sort of not have irrational attachments to mythos and whatever. And so when it hears that those features uh, are no longer part of the ongoing narrative, that it is not so distraught that it becomes incapacitated, that the logos sort of has to be rebooted. And so, the whole thing has to shut down, and then it has to sort of build itself up from nothing almost, and reinvent the role that one is playing in one's own sense of narrative. What the Stoic is doing is it's unplugging itself from the narrative, um, and it's keeping its logos in an agile state, in a fluid state, that's able to take the shape of whatever container is immediately presenting itself. And it's sort of, the logos is agile enough to do that, um, because it doesn't have attachments. Now, I think a neater way of saying, I mean, that might be the practical method of how you get to sort of that more elaborated description. But I think the curt way of describing that is simply that the logos is the domain, the logos's domain is moral consideration, actual moral consideration, not hypothetical moral consideration. And so, in some sense, the reason why in practice Stoics engage in hypothetical contemplations is because they're trying to exhaust and sort of unhinge their propensity to be attached to considerations, to hypothetical um, niceties, and which would operate as a kind of, as a bias or a prejudice, upon the immediate deployment of logos when it's needed, in some sense. Um, and so, in some sense, logos becomes the purview of an actual morality, and not the sort of the illusion and fantasy which the mind might otherwise be in the habit of entertaining. And so the desensitization of those habitual dependencies and reliances and comforts um, that one extracts from the moral domain, um, by taking logos beyond the actual moral domain and putting it in hypothetical moral um, but are actually de facto sort of self-referencing, self-catering, sort of hobby horse, sort of indulgences. Um, yeah, I keep on repeating myself now. So let me just go back to the point. So the point is that I think a better way of describing Stoicism is that the logos becomes specifically bounded to the moral domain, to the real moral domain, which is always a real and immediate, which is only which is a literal reflexive property of being really engaged. Obviously, whenever I say this, I always have to sort of apologize that the actual Stoic training is almost the exact opposite of that, because it is trying to desensitize the propensity towards self indulgence, where this where these conditions that I'm describing are frustrated. Okay, so I find, yeah, so again, is that you only let the logos serve morality. You don't let it serve imagination, basically. Even though in the training thereof, one is creating uncomfortable fantasy in order to detach the logos from comfort and convenience of a kind of self-catering nature. And when I say self, I'm sort of talking about the mind itself or consciousness itself, and that really means in this context hypothetical considerations, hypothetical thoughts, which are in some sense not actual and not actually for the purpose of actual morality. It's sort of just a kind of it's a false engagement. Okay, so I don't know. This is not an interesting tangent. Yeah, so again, I think that Stoicism does suffer from a general issues that it has not perhaps developed a meta-Stoicism about itself, taking, so it's sort of, it seems to me that it's a sort of, the backing of it really has to come from virtue ethics, that it itself is just a model or a method of how to practically access virtue ethics in some sense. And then the articulation, so it's just a way of magnifying virtue ethics. And perhaps in that sense, it taken to be a technique in that way. That's good enough. But for it to actually wield a more proactive approach, and as I've already tried to lay out, the real problem that it has is freedom. When it actually has a kind of a creative opportunity, it's very good at mitigating adversity and maximizing prospective or proactive, sort of its justice that it's able to sort of exemplify is contingent on a kind of on a set of options which are fully computable in terms of having definitive, sort of trade-offs. But as soon as there's a kind of fundamental indecision. It's not really capable of breaking any tie on the level of sort of, because it has no generative, creative impetus within itself. And I don't think it really has the resources to do that. And yeah, I do think that that's fundamentally problematic, because in some sense then the virtue itself I don't even know if I want to finish this train of thought. Um, I mean, there are actually ways around this, in some sense, and I think the answer is it's interesting. Everything that comes back to sort of antinatalism. It is a very interesting sort of idea, because the core of my moral system, which is a kind of rational, logical sort of thing, which actually is described basically by the Hindu religion, which I believe is the door to mastering all karma, all mental karma. And it keeps one, when one orders one's life towards this principle, you have to have a regulatory principle that governs your life, otherwise you will not be ethical. And so basically the highest ethical system has to have one overarching vision and pursuit. And so I was just caught in my own head comparing that to antinatalism to see if antinatalism actually serves that principle. And in some indirect sense, it can, if one is pessimistic or cynical. But yeah, well, yeah, I would say in the final analysis it does not, but it shows how the Logos is capable of manifesting an actual form of inspiration. Let me stop talking around this and just name it. But so the principle that I govern my whole moral system around, and this is not in the abstract ideal form, but this is in terms of a regulatory principle of behavior and action, is that you must not create unwanted population. That is the largest ill in the world. It is the highest crime. It is to create unwanted population. That is evil. That is the only evil that there actually is the creation of unwanted population. If your actions lead to the creation of unwanted population, it is bad. Now, it's somewhat itself, you cannot be consequent. Now, you see, I called it an ethic. This is not a consequentialist utilitarian measure, which makes it very, very complicated. Because you actually have to achieve that through real principles, which means that, there are perhaps a lot of eggs that are going to be cracked to make that omelette. And it's very hard to get it right. Everything has to work in concert beautifully to not create unwanted population. Many things have to go right, and only one thing need go wrong, and you sort of mess that up tremendously. And what turns out is that without real discerning, without sort of philosophical dimensions that have real roots, It's interesting that in Stoicism there were two descriptions: the dog being led around by a cart, and the bamboo swaying in the wind. And again, the bamboo swaying in the wind, the bamboo just grew there. It inherited its position, and it's fluid enough to sway in the wind. The dog being led around by a cart, that would be fine if that was the truth. There are some things that are leading us around like a cart. There are elements that do that, but then there are other elements that are different. The problem is Stoicism doesn't deal with the variety too much. It can deal with the cart leading the dog around, but what about sort of the dog that gets unleashed from the cart for long enough, so much so that it has to choose between different carts, and so periodically it might have a choice to abandon one cart and combine its fate or its new journey, uh, have it be appended to a different cart, and so those choices is something, just to sort of the analogy, is something that seems problematic for Stoicism. I don't think it really has the resources to contend with those issues so much. And this idea that there's this kind of eternal citizenship of this sort of like logos as a kind of collective human sort of enterprise that is sort of being collectively accumulated. It's weird because I do think that it is disjointed within Stoicism's own setup, is that it breaks the immediate connection that the individual has, and it sort of manufactures it reverts to a default consequentialism that everyone is sort of this brick in this wall. And it does do weird things to the concept of logos, in which it doesn't just become the master of morality, it becomes a kind of pseudo deity as well, I believe. Which also, I believe, occurs in other sort of capacities as well, and that happens through a kind of smuggling. Of a kind of an assumed concert of sort of accumulated effort that is sort of on the same page, sort of that, and in some sense it can only do that because it sort of claims that we're individual dogs, but we all are leashed to the same cart, and so as we share the sort of the pace of that cart, our accumulated and shared experience around the same cart, which is a kind of a shared adversity, is the source of a kind of universal piece of the puzzle. Excuse me. And this I think has to do with the misconception of logos itself. is that thought is somewhat commensurate with the source code of reality, and the kind of, the sort of the matrix behind the grand curtain of it all. And that the sort of the logos that we are connected with in our head. And I do think that this is disparate with the core of Stoicism, which is essentially that you don't get to have a relationship with the logos. The relationship is your morality is connected to the logos, but your actual thinking, your churning out your considerations, they don't. So in some sense, your moral principles are governed by the logos, but your thinking has no direct connection to the logos at all. And that is how I think the logos also removes itself from the pollution of the mythos. And sadly, the idea that, we're all leashed to the same cart, that becomes a pseudo mythos. And so again, I say that the problem is that I do think that too much of something that is labeled as Stoicism, or a kind of pure logos enterprise, ends up just becoming the kind of the vehicle of a covert mythos, essentially, of a constructed mythos. A de facto construct. And again, I think it with ignorance, also the whole Stoical system, in its nescience and its naivety, it falls into also being criticized for essentially sort of maximizing the aims of the collective narrative that it somewhat sort of just finds itself in wrapped up and encapsulated within, so sort of like you're maximizing your decisions as an individual, and that has this indirect benefit of this collateral support to your society and your collective, but do they deserve it? And it somewhat avoids asking that question because it doesn't poison itself with any kind of consequentialist belief, although I think that because it's always keeping its powder dry towards some kind of a kind of eternal proactive consequentialism that never gets cashed out as an actual image, as a just kind of as a maximized capacity, and it doesn't ever look back at itself and reduce its activity into a narrative, because that would be to sort of to entertain so those are sort of ancillary issues that I think might be swept up to some extent, perhaps, by the detail of virtue ethics. But I do think Plato himself suffered from these kinds of issues, which I think are very obvious in the Republic. Even though his metaphysical system, I think, is very important and is the basis of a lot of my psychological thinking, if you actually take the model of the Republic, I believe what he is in fact describing is what I would just call a form of insanity, which is somewhat ironic because I share Plato's view that, justice, effectively defining justice as sanity. I do think a lot of these issues as well would just sort of. I mean, you could. I think you could fix a lot of these issues by just sort of tracking these and evaluating these topics in line with Professor Vasti Root's uh, insight on Nietzsche's uh, nihilism, and sort of and seeing the kind of the absurdist themes being played out. Um, I do think Stoicism does have a valid sort of application somewhere in there, although I would also argue that it's in the fabric of at least her development of Nietzsche's thinking. I think I don't have anything else to say. It also makes sense that there's an element of isolation that comes from this, which then sadly ends up being answered by this kind of metaphysical compact and this kind of this kind of sort of Newtonian model building, of that we're all contributing our piece of the puzzle, and because of all the various different cards that we're leashed to, that there's a matrix of justice to be compiled, and that is perhaps worthy of running all of our lives, perhaps, or yeah, I might make another recording that gets into the kind of the political implications of this, and the kind of perhaps the cultural and that link and the link between the philosophy and those aspects.